Meanwhile, Bob, you're my poetry guru. That's
Oh
all I
my.
can tell you. You really
Oh.
are. How did you get interested in poetry?
How did I get interested in poetry?
Yeah.
Uh, well, I really don't remember because I was much too young. It's one of these things when you start out patty cake, baker's man, those kinds of things from my parents. So I guess I just came in with that, and I think we all do, and then we kind of get away from it there. But it was all those nursery rhymes and those kinds of things way back.
So they're
That's what.
valuable. They're valuable, aren't they?
Oh, they're incredibly valuable, and I think sometimes we dismiss that so many times. I think that's, and then poetry becomes something so intellectual, and so that, we start going into all that academic kinds of stuff, and we forget what it was really about there in the very beginning. It's a lot about sounds. It's about connections with people, either the people we love, people in the past. A lot of connections there.
I'm, I'm
Did
thinking
I lose
Paul's.
people there?
No, no, no. I was just for sure Paul was going to ask you a question. I just knew it.
Oh no, I'm just
Oh,
enjoying it so far, getting accustomed to where we are with poetry. I love it.
Uh, Paul, you do a lot of poetry. You love poetry, and Paul has a family of wonderful daughters, and I know he reads a lot to his kids. Which is Bob. Bob, I know that's something you're
oh,
strong on.
right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Reading to your kids and having your kids read to you.
Oh,
And sharing that back and forth. And even finding a good, like here's a good poem. Or have you heard this one? I love it when my daughter comes home with something and like that. It could be whatever it may be. It could be some kind of Jim Crow poem. It can be anything. But I love that.
Well, they seem to learn
And
easier.
now, Carol,
My
I'm just
daughters
seeing a
do.
picture of you. I don't see the line.
well, we hear you still, so we're going by sound. Think of this as
Hmm.
feel like you're in Mars, and we're getting you from
Okay,
Mars
that's
right
fine.
now.
I'm going to assume it's all kind of working, and that'll be great. No,
Well, we're making
it's
progress.
fun working.
Oh, it's fun. But
Yeah.
Paul, you were about to say. Go ahead.
Oh well, in just learning, I have in my house a bevy of little women. I'm a father of daughters, and
Hmm.
I want to ask about Louisa May Alcott, and
Oh,
what do you have to say about her and her importance in American literature?
oh my gosh. Well, of course, when Carol had first asked me about doing this, and I was thinking like late 19th century, and I was thinking poetry more than anything else. But Louisa May Alcott also wrote poetry,
Hmm.
in addition to Little Women and so forth. She's got a number of poems she's written. We just don't know them as much. But I think from my daughter, who's 11 years old, she was talking, Louisa May Alcott, Little Women was one of the first books she read when she was like, one of the big books, when she was like 6 or 7, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So, I think Louisa May Alcott is huge. And so much of that late 19th century poetry, and in poetry in particular, we don't, in universities and so forth, we don't study that as literature as much. So it becomes Americana. Our poetry that we get out of that time frame is Americana. And I put Louisa May Alcott in that time frame, along with Eugene Field and James Whitmore Riley, and these kinds of people.
Well, aren't there a lot of authors, so to speak, who we know them for other works, but they have a ton of poetry? It seems that they don't get known for the poetry as much. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Or sometimes we'll, again, in that time frame, we don't really study the poetry of Emma Lazarus, but we all know that poem at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, and we don't study Catherine Lee Bates, but we all know that America the Beautiful, which I think originally was called Pikes Peak, because I think I think that was called Pikes Peak, if I remember. And, or we know Julia Ward Howe, from Battle Hymn of the Republic, but she also wrote other types of things as well. So you get, yeah, that kind of works like that.
Well, and Americana is something that we're also, I think, coming to value more. But when I was just saying at the beginning, I was so taken by German and Russian poets, I didn't understand what an active poetic scene it was, and especially in this 19th century, and especially New England. I mean, there was blockbuster people walking around those tidy little streets with
Oh,
those beautiful houses. Do you have a favorite of that group, of the Wayside Poems or the Fireside Poets? I mean, do you have some favorites, or tell us about that whole thing going on up there in New England?
oh God. Well, I don't know. It'd be hard for me to pick a favorite at any one given moment. I mean, I've always been a big Longfellow fan, and Longfellow. I mean, so much of his, even like the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which was earlier in the, it wouldn't be late 19th century, but that borrowed from some of the rhythms of German poetry. I mean, that's what he did. In fact, later in his career in the 1870s, I think, or somewhere in there, he's known more as I think he translated one of Dante's Divine Comedy and some of that type of thing as well. But I mean, he would be one of my favorites, and Emily Dickinson, of course, is one of my favorites. Although you got to remember, even though she wrote during that time frame, her poetry wasn't available in this country or anywhere until I think the first supposedly complete set was in the 20s, and then the real set came out in the 50s with what she actually wrote, because so much of the poetry that got published of hers were put together by her sister and the publisher, and they would change them around to fit the framework of the day. But
Was she connected well social? I mean, what people speak so lovingly of her. I mean, was she as private a person as we think she was? Was she part of this crowd? Did she?
No, she was private. She was private. I mean, people didn't. I mean, they didn't. I mean, you're talking about really. She had 15 bajillion poems in her drawer.
Really? 15 bajillion.
No, so she would not have hung around in that same circle, and some of the, like Louisa May Alcott did with some of the others there.
What is this group? Well, I know this is going to the later. Is that group the Fireside Poets? Is that as well? Is that a pretty well? I mean, the time they were pretty popular. Yes.
Yeah.
And yet we don't know James Russell Lowe. We don't know those guys today. What happened? And is their poetry considered important, or was it just trendy? Or tell me, I can't understand the whole thing sometimes.
I think it didn't make the cut in academia. I think that's where it came around. It was popular. I mean, and then when poetry kind of went out of the popularity type things, it didn't show up as much anymore. Then all of a sudden they went by the way, but James Russell Lowell, I mean, he was very popular. Olive Wendell Hunt, the whole group. There was a lot of people who read poetry, and it came into its own in the late 19th century. And people began to memorize poetry in the classrooms and so forth. And here's the issue in some ways is not so much who was writing what in the 19th century. The popular poetry of what was being studied. Actually, they were now bringing back at that time, they were discovering the poets. They were discovering Longfellow's early poems, and they were discovering Whitman's and so forth. Let me say one other thing too, Carol and Paul. In terms of American history, you got the 19th century. A lot of times it's looked at, the dividing line in America is that Civil War, which of course in the 1860 to 65. So it always gives that edge to what came before, and we kind of I think of that. I shouldn't say, but I think it's presented so many times as what came after the Civil War and what came before, and even like talk about Longfellow who was an abolitionist poet and wrote a lot of those kinds of poems, but even like Courtship of Miles Standish, if I remember, was like 1862. It was during the Civil War.
Isn't that crazy to think about that right in the middle of the Civil War?
Oh yeah, I mean, and so those were poems that, and I would imagine that they then would be discovered and read more towards the end of the century. It's sort of like, maybe we discovered maybe a generation later, and of course Walt Whitman was, I mean, he had all the poems that he wrote about the Civil War that were very popular. There's that great Walt Whitman story about "Oh Captain, My Captain." "Oh Captain, My Captain."
Yes.
And it's in every 11th grade school book, and it was such a humongously popular poem that, and like a rock star, because he lived for a long time there, he was always asked to do it. And like rock stars today, it got to be one of these things where he so resented doing that poem. He wanted to do something new he'd written, and people, no, we want to hear "When the Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom." We want to hear "Oh Captain, My Captain." And he wanted to move away from that. But anyway, people were discovering, in the late 19th century, they were discovering those poems written much earlier. Am I still the icon there, or no?
No, you're still the icon. It's really, since I've known you a long time, Bob Paul, seeing you in this robotic form, I'm sure is frustrating to most people, but I'm kind of getting a big kick out of it.
Well, there you go. Okay. I mean, I see on my computer, I see a little picture here. I mean, I know that's not what we're talking about, but
yeah, there's something about the cameras, but we're going to see you more than once. We know we're going to have you as our guest. We're very graciously excited throughout this semester that you're going to be able to visit us. More than once, and we'll get that. We had it working perfectly yesterday, didn't we? Just so everybody knows, we always do our homework, but homework doesn't always work out, does it, Paul?
No, that's for sure.
So
we do have some questions from people who are watching. Would you like me to ask one of those questions right now?
Go for it.
Okay. Someone is asking, can Mr. Falls, Jane is asking, can he recommend some poems that he thinks would especially be good for teens, for kids to memorize from that time period?
From that time period?
Yes.
You can. Well, of course, the Emily Dickinson pieces are always fun because most of them are relatively short. So that's always a very good thing. They're short. But so many poems, like Casey at the Bat, that have those rhythms and that type of frame, and for teenage, that's one that's like the humorous poetry of Guy Wetmore Carroll, like the embarrassing episode of Little Miss Muffet. Little Miss Muffet discovered a tuffet which never occurred to the rest of us, and as 'twas a June day and just about noonday, she wanted to eat like the best of us. Anyway, it's a great little, and all his poems, by the way, end with a zinger, so they're always a lot of fun. Kids like that. It's always funny. Or John Godfrey Sachs, who was a performance poet, and that's during that time frame, wrote "The Blind Men and the Elephant." 'Twas 6 men of Hindustan to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind. And that's a fun little fun little piece. And that's also, if for Jean, if she's listening, that would be a poem that kids can do together and have fun to memorize like that. So then, from that same time frame, you got all the Little Orphan Annies and the Eugene Fields, those type poetry, those poems too.
That's Riley, and you love Riley. I grew up listening to Riley. I don't think anybody reads that anymore. Can you give us one of those off the top of your head, as they say, or?
Little Orphan Annie's come to our house to stay, to wash the cups and saucers up and brush the crumbs away and shoo the chickens off the porch and dust the hearth and sweep and make the bread and fix and do the fire and earn her board and keep and all us other children. When the supper things is done, we sit around the kitchen fire and have the mostest fun a-listening to the witch tales that Annie tells about, and the goblins'll get you if you don't watch out. And I love that. That's a fun one to do too.
I know we have a lot of other questions too, but I'll tell you what, knowing Bob Falls, if you go anywhere with Bob Falls or you can just be, at the Whataburger or in I don't know, it could be the color of the tomatoes or the way somebody winks or something, and out will come a poem. You just got to be prepared for that.
Wow.
What other questions do we have, Paul?
Oh, well, okay. You mentioned, Bob, having like the poems that have comedy in them, or well, I see it as don't take themselves as so seriously. You mentioned in the interview that's online that you did with Carol a long time ago, or at least not too long ago, but a little while ago, you said that the discussions by teachers, when you learn poetry, that you're often being asked as a student, what do you think that the poet is trying to say? Is this the example of taking it too seriously, or what can you say
Well,
about
I
that?
think it's a mixed message.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, you're telling students this is one of the great writers or whatever it is, and the next breath you're saying, what do you think the poet was trying to say? That type of thing. And it's, so that's goes on there. And that just sends a wrong signal to kids.
Well, why do you
Uh,
think it's being taught that way?
I know we've been taught that way. I think poetry is not. I mean, I've often thought if we taught movies the way poetry is taught, there wouldn't be a Cineplex in the country. No one would go to them. So, but I think I'm trying to get back to where my thought was. I apologize. This is like one of the worst things. I had my phone still on, and didn't click that off there. But for
Well,
kids.
I was always wrong. Whenever the teacher said, "What do you think the author was trying to say, Paul?" and I would give my interpretation, I guess, and it was always wrong.
Well, I don't understand that. I've never been able to understand that approach. And when we started doing Poetry Alive, and we looked at it just simply from how are you going to perform this poem, and sometimes it's who is saying what to whom, and then you have to come like from an actor point of view, from motivation. Well, are you saying it? What are you going to be shouting it out? What's going to be happening there? And and so that when you start doing that, you do come up with different ways of looking at something. But I've never liked the idea that this is wrong. It's almost like we have a poetry priest or whatever, you have to go to, and this is the interpretation that you learn. So you're really not connecting with the poem, you're connecting with the interpretations. Does that
Well,
make sense?
sure,
And I
it
don't like
does.
that.
And
I've never liked that. And I think that's one of the things, that's why people don't, poetry, they walk out of the classroom and then never read a poem again. And it's sad to me.
yeah, well, much of poetry is, it seems, meant to be read out loud as your poetry
Yeah.
alive.
Oh yeah, you read out loud and you to someone else, and have them hear, and then share poems back and forth. And you can do it with the poems out of our that's in our literature, or you can do poems you write themselves. I had a friend of mine on my Facebook page, and she said, she also goes around to schools, and she had a great thing she was telling her students the other day. She said, don't ever find a poem so good that you're afraid to go back and look at your own page. That you're afraid to go back and write your own poems. And so but you want that engagement with the poetry that we read. You want that also to connect with students, so they are going to feel comfortable writing their own words. And this is how we communicate.
Wow. Well, that's what did it for me. I threw it away for a while, and it wasn't until we started. I was believe it or not, working in baseball, and we were stuck in a press box, and we had nothing to do, and we passed around a book of short stories and prose, and would make each other read them out loud, sort of a
Oh yeah.
poetry reading, if you will, and it really inspired me. I started writing my own, and then going and performing them at coffee houses and things.
Oh, that is wonderful. That is just wonderful. I mean, I love hearing that kind of stuff. That's exactly what it's about.
If you take something like the big long ones that are intimidating even as an adult, except you don't fear them. Well, I've just contradicted myself, but that's normal for me. But I take about something like Evangeline, for example, Bob, or Hiawatha, or I mean, we don't think in long, epic, poetic fashion anymore. We don't envision something even. Isn't that part of the problem? We don't have that kind of mental framework. It's not just the lines or the words. Or what do you think makes that harder to approach?
You mean it's the difficulty in approaching longer poems, you mean?
Like the Hiawatha or the Evangeline. Yeah, the longer epic with those magnificent stories. Because I know in this unit I talk about Hiawatha, or maybe it's next week I talk about Hiawatha. Somewhere along the line we're talking about Hiawatha. But my mother's generation memorized. So I mean, in a good way. I mean, maybe they didn't like it, maybe they did like it, but they were. That they live for those poems, but we have a harder time with that today. Why? What keeps us from entering into that kind of a lengthy epic poetry?
I think it's just changes in fashion, changes in style, and it's because we've also come to be taught that poetry has a certain form and that's different, and we think of poetry as something. A short something on 1 page or 2 pages, and we don't think of the long, expansive. I mean, I had this. I was able to I downloaded it for free from one of those ebook things because we had a lot of snow here this past week, and I couldn't let it go by without John Greenleaf Whittier's Snowbound, for goodness sakes, and so it's but. I think it's just people go by and so they don't read that anymore. They don't pick up those real long epic pieces. They'll read like Sir Walter Scott's Lochinvar, but that's just a small little piece that comes out of that whole book of Marmion, or that long 80-page work. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's a style and fashion, and I would love to see poetry come back in where you get those long poems written. That are sort of like a novel. I mean, it's neat.
Yeah. I can think of so many questions, but I always get to talk to you a lot, so it's not fair for me to ask them.
It's great to see you, Carol, by the way.
Yeah, I'd like to see. I never knew you were so blue. I mean,
there you go. You
go. This is a whole new aspect, but I think again about, were those guys, and not just guys, obviously guys and gals, did they know they were really kind of an uncharted course in our new country before the Civil War as well, that they needed to establish a solid American heritage that could compete with Europeans? They knew their European traditions. They knew that somebody needed to step up and become the new American poetry school. Were they conscious of that?
Oh, yeah. They were I think most of them were very conscious of it. I mean, I don't think they were necessarily out to try to create a new style. But they were very aware that most of what people were reading, they were reading things imported from England and France and so forth, and all of a sudden your writers here in America were just taking a back seat. Now, of course, there are some good reasons for that, and some of that has to do with, like Hank would know about the copyright laws, that, okay, we can get something in from England and we'll just print that, and who cares? We can just print that. We can print anything from or Sir Walter Scott, and we don't have to pay him a thing for it. But if somebody here locally in America wants to write something, it's a different deal. So some of that was at play too. That's what. Some of that very tangible working on copyright materials helped change that and made it possible that for people to write poems. It's like Edgar Allan Poe with The Raven, and when we used to perform Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, we kind of put together, Poetry Alive did, kind of our own version of The Raven, taken from his 6 or 7 or however many different versions he had, because if you got paid for writing a poem, you didn't get any money just for somebody else to reprint it. You had to do it again differently. So you'd have to make some changes and tweaks in it. And so you'll get some of these poems like that you'll find, and it'll be one way in one place and another one in another place. It's an interesting kind of way, but especially at that time, because I don't think they had any provision for the copyright aspect then.
So what would it sound like when you made your own version? I mean, how different would it be, or you still have that in your head?
You mean
your Raven, or I mean, would we all recognize it?
he would just change a few words here and there. I mean,
So,
that's all that would be. I mean, the rhythms and all would be the same, but he had to make enough changes so he gets some, an extra $25 or whatever he charged for it.
well, you know what that actually reminds me of, and I'm trying to think, it's Turandot, the Puccini opera Turandot, both being correct, and it's based on a Schiller play, if I'm getting, this is suddenly coming back to me, and the three riddles, as I remember, they would change the riddles in different performances so people would continue to come back to the play, and of course, if the character couldn't solve the riddles, he would be beheaded as one of Turandot's latest victims. And so I was just now remembering, there's a lot of different versions of the end of that play because they had to keep changing the riddles to get the new audience. Is it something like that?
Oh, I didn't. That's an interesting. It would be kind of like that. I mean, and because you have to know that like a lot of these, there weren't the mass, even the mass newspapers that were around back. I mean, they just weren't there in that early part of the century, of the 19th century, and so that meant that a poet like Edgar Allan Poe could sell to a paper in Baltimore and a paper in New York and a paper in Richmond, and he could do the same kind of poem. But if they knew but they could also get that paper and just copy it out and pay him and not pay him anything.
So it's hard to make a living as a poet now and then.
Yeah. That was one of the, but that was so anyway. That's that's another whole big issue though in writing. But I think these people were the people writing were trying to. I mean, they recognized that they were competing with Europe, and I mean, I think that. I don't know. I bet Hank would probably know more about it, but I bet that was one of the reasons for the push for a lot of that different copyright laws and so forth. I think I mentioned Horace Greeley with the New York Herald had a lot to do with writing some of the copyright laws back in those days.
Well, when did Europe decide that we had some pretty good poetry going on here? Or who gets noticed in Europe, or how does that unfold?
Well, I mean, Poe became enormously popular in Europe. I mean, he became, and he influenced a lot of writers over there, like Baudelaire and so forth. I mean, he was one of the classics. I don't know who, I don't know who makes those kinds of decisions. It just kind of happens. Who ends up. And that changes too over time. I mean, sometimes people are, they're very popular at one point and they get discovered. I think Longfellow was Longfellow was popular all over Europe. And in fact, I mean, because Russia, didn't he get some kind of like major Russian acknowledgement of some kind of university in Russia? I mean, some kind of big award in Russia. I mean, I don't know now, man.
I don't know.
I mean, it'd be something. But I know he was. Well known. I'm sitting here at my computer. I almost want to look up at him. I'm afraid I'll do some kind of damage here.
Yeah. You might not be a blue icon anymore.
I know, right?
We're going to keep what we've got. We're going to do this again so we can turn you into your smiling face that we all want to see. But it has been kind of unforgettable. Now I'm an icon. I think this is iconic. Longfellow. All right, Longfellow. I bet you. What do you think, Paul? If we went on the streets, we'd have a hard time people even barely knowing who Longfellow is today. Where would you say to someone to start, or again, I mean, the same like the question that was asked. What do you do? Are you better off picking one poem, one part of an epic poem? What do give us a Longfellow therapy here, Bob.
Oh, you mean somebody finding a poem?
Yeah, let's talk about Longfellow. What would you do? I'm in desperate need to know Longfellow better because he was so important in the 19th century, and he was acclaimed, and he's in paintings, European-style paintings.
Oh, yeah.
Know that. So how do we approach it? What do we do?
Well, I mean, I would, you go with it's kind of like you go with the greatest hits. You look first, see what people what are other people like. I mean, I'm one of these people. I look at see what gets nominated for the best poetry of the year and so forth. And so I, like best movies and so forth. I want to make sure I kind of catch those. So you go for the ones, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and the Song of Hiawatha, the Courtship of Miles Standish. You go for those kinds of poems. and you see how you feel about it. How do you like them? I mean, that's to me what you do. Now, if you want to know specifically more about Longfellow, then you would read a lot more of that, and sometimes, and I know when I go through in the educational system, they spend a lot of time on the biographies of poets and their stories, and that does have a big impact. I mean, Longfellow had so many tragedies, and
Like what? Tell us about them.
Well, he had his first wife died, and then he had another wife who got caught in a fire in the curtains, and she, it was a horrible kind of thing, and this is that's part of what's the Psalm of Life poem he's got that gets quoted a lot. I can't quote it right now, but I'm just trying to, and I'm not even sure that's it, so I'm kind of glad it's just the blue icon and not me puzzling it, because otherwise you see me scratching my head trying to puzzle.
Yeah, icons are better for that. Well, tragedy does seem to inspire poets to write a lot, doesn't it? I mean, almost, if this is getting into the early 20th century, we'll get to it in the course, but we're going to be talking about the gospel writer of text, right? Because hymns, of course, are poems. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me to the promised land. And, he wrote that. Thomas Dorsey, right?
Yeah, Thomas Dorsey.
After coming home and I know Paul knows this one, finding out that his wife had died and the new baby that wasn't supposed to be due quite yet, or that he'd gone off to a gospel early 20s gospel, when that was in the infancy. He'd gone off to, I'm telling the story now, but he'd gone off to do a job, even though she was very close to her due date, but everything seemed fine, and there's no telephones or anything, so by the time he got home, he found out he'd lost his wife and he'd lost that baby. I mean, that's a heck of a homecoming, and he shuts himself up in the room, and the only thing that got him out was that poem, Precious Lord. I mean, that's powerful stuff.
That is powerful. He's one of my favorites too, by the way. Do you know that movie? Did you ever see that documentary about him?
I think so. Maybe a while.
Say Amen, somebody.
Yes.
That is a great documentary at that time. And it's Thomas Dorsey. It's the other gospel kind of thing too, but the role, I mean, he had such a huge role in all of that.
Yeah, Paul, is he one of your people, or I mean?
Well, actually, I think you're the one that taught me that of that history of that. So I have to thank you for that. But I love that song, and I have actually a performance of that song, which is my favorite. Crystal Lewis sings that song. If I can ask, somebody put up a question. And this would be going back, but someone was asking about teaching poetry, and if you have some tips rather than the what we talked about with the teacher telling you need to tell me what he was trying to say. What are some tips for teaching poetry?
Well, and I'll fall back on my company, which I sold a few years ago, Poetry Alive. It'll be celebrating its 30th anniversary this coming August.
Yay.
But the whole idea of what we did there was to try to find a way to approach poetry to actually get away from that, what do you think the poet was trying to say questions. And what we would do is we treated each poem in a theatrical way. So instead of asking what a poem means, you would ask, how would you perform that piece? That's so whether you want to say act it out, and you would stage that poem. And when you do that, all of the analysis and interpretation, those great things we talk, all of that becomes just very concrete and tangible for students. And that is just, and we have used that with 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and university students. And it gets them out of that mix of all that stuff about poetry and I would like it, but I just don't understand. It always puts you in a lesser place. The approach that we use with poetry puts you in the role of I'm not qualified enough to really appreciate it or understand it. And you don't have to accept that role. I don't accept that role. I mean, I may read a poem and I may not understand it, but I don't really care.
with Poetry Alive, where does this happen? Are there
conferences?
Poetry Alive, it's in schools, libraries, universities, and now all over the world. I mean, the two people, they had worked for me. Actually, one of the actors started working back in the first part of like 2001, that type of thing. So, and anyway, they're getting ready to head off to South America. There are different teams that go around the country, though. They're going to be out in Texas. I think I saw somewhere in League City, around the Houston area, later on this. You can go to poetryalive.com and there's a map of the U.S. and click on there and see where they're going to be. I mean, since I'm kind of out of the loop these days because I'm just kind of the ex-owner and
the founder. I remember when you founded it because I remember that was a bold thing for you to do and to figure out a way to make a company and employ a lot of actor poets. People, I mean, that's where you kept a lot of people eating for, and it still does. And what's a typical session like? And if you can sort of let's think about homeschooling families, maybe or co-ops or small schools or classical academies. What would you're not there maybe to lead their session, but how would you start it off? You've got a couple of tutors. What would you tell them to do if they want to make their own little miniature version of a Poetry Alive session?
Well, and we do this when we work with students. We work with students so that the students, and the goal is they put on their own show.
What does that mean? Where do you start?
Well,
you got to.
Well, you would have them. First, you do the poetry search. Now we would sometimes come in and do a little poetry performance just so they get the idea of it. But I mean, all of these kids, I mean, they watch television, they watch videos and so forth like that, and they know what acting is about. And so you're giving all of a sudden them the permission to say, take these words on a page and show us something. Come back to us in 30 minutes and let's see what you got. But you then have them do a poetry search. If you have a group of 10 students, 20 students, 30 students, and for homeschool groups that you work with, because a lot of times they'll have times when they do get together like that. We used to work with those homeschool students. I mean, they would get together, be smaller groups, but they would then put on a show for all the parents and the parents' relatives, and so they would have a venue for that. But you would have them put together the poems, and then they would perform the poems for each other, and they would get the feedback and say, oh, try it this way, try it that way. So they become the directors of the work. But that's how, that's the way that we did it over the years, and that was the way we got out of the, what do you think a poet was trying to say, just totally eliminate that from the language.
I love it.
And I know you love to say don't memorize, you learn it by heart. That's what you're
learn by heart, absolutely. Absolutely. No need to use the M word.
Yeah, because so is it okay if a kid, if I'm a kid and I start to do Invictus and interrupt with any other questions, Paul, for sure, but if I go, out in the night that covers me, black is the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul, what are you going to do to help me, Bob?
Well, I mean, it's sort of like getting back to Edgar Allan Poe, it's kind of like the Raven. The rhythm a lot of times will help you remember the words and remember the lines, but then you got to get beyond the rhythm. So a lot of times it's just saying it and just saying and taking a piece of a line. So what are you going to do with it? Where are you going to stand? Where are you going to look? Is your right arm going to be gesturing? And once you begin to set up different kinds of stage actions, that will have a way of informing the words and the delivery. It will change it. It will change how they do that. So you really will get away from the that da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da stuff. Although that da-da-da-da-da stuff is good, that does help memorize. It does help you learn the poem.
So it's okay if I were to, if you would tell a kid, out of the night that covered me, and I want to fly from the back of the curtain into the main area, that's okay. The poem lets me do that.
Oh yeah. One of the lines I used to say, let the words tell you what to do. Let the words tell you what to do. And listen to those words. and listen to what they are telling you. Are they saying you should be standing? What are they telling you? Should you be sitting, jumping off the moon? And even there, then how are you going to do that? So anyway, yeah, that's what and kids get it. I mean, the thing I always wondered about as a company is, and I felt sometimes kind of guilty, is because we were being paid for these kids to do stuff that they automatically do anyway. And of course, the Poetry Alive approach was always you work with kindergarten, first graders, and second graders in the same way you would with high school students, and you work with high school students in the way you would with first graders and kindergarten, those students. I mean, in terms of the putting together the show and doing that. I mean, they're working with different material, but because for that age group, you get the teenage. Gene was asking about teenagers. Sometimes teenagers, they get a little more guarded. They don't want to put themselves out, and a little nervous about, okay, I don't know if I really want to stand up and shout, or I want to do this, and so you find a way to get around and let them be that second grader again.
What during that time period that we're talking about here, what are some of the most provocative works that you can think of?
Oh,
I know lately, when I think of poetry currently, you've got Deaf Poetry Jam. You have people who, even when I was in the coffee house doing poetry, there were a lot of people who were really, all they wanted to do was provoke. They just were just throwing things out there, trying to get a response.
At that time, well, you had a lot of political poetry. I mean, one of the most famous poems was Edwin Markham's "The Man with the Hoe," and it was basically the man with the hoe was it was like a big thing for the agrarian movement in politics. It was very big.
What was it about? Can you tell us what it was about? I don't know that one.
The man with the hoe it's the working man, the farmer, especially the farming working man, the rural, and I mean it was like the drudgery and the work, and in some ways there were also a lot of it they're tied into who they have to borrow money from and so forth like that. Another at that same time frame, and we know him more because of novels, but Stephen Crane from middle school kids. Stephen Crane has some bizarre poems, like a man said to the universe, and I'm not going to be able to know, but a man said to the universe, why are you chasing me like this? I mean, there are things like that. Another one is about eating out your heart. I mean, really, I eat my heart because it tastes good. I mean, it's weird stuff. And they're also very short poems, too. Look up some of Stephen Crane's work, though. I mean, it's like some of his poetry. We would actually, in the middle school shows, we would couple his poems with Edgar Allan Poe all the time because they're little short pieces, and the kids would really engage with them. But anyway, you were talking about provocative kinds of stuff. I mean, that was there. And also, for that matter, Emma Lazarus, the Statue of Liberty lady, had very political pieces that she wrote back at that time. So there was a lot of that around. We don't really study it as such anymore.
Did abolition poetry play a pretty strong role in bringing about the changes?
Oh, you mean changes in poetry? Well,
no, changes in politics, changes in awareness of slavery.
Yeah. I mean, the abolition poetry had I think they had a big impact in our culture and society back then, and it popularized it all. Of course, you have to know that there were also, in this day and time, we read a lot of the abolitionist poetry. If you really want to engage in some provocative poetry, works by Henry Timrod and people like that who are I think he was like the poet of the Confederacy type of thing, you know, because there were a lot of, you know, the people who were writing about how good slavery was, you know. I mean,
You
there were
don't read
poets.
those. You don't read those anymore, do you?
No, and they don't, and they don't show up. And you know, and the thing is, I mean, you know, a lot of times, and the same thing for abolition poetry. I mean, if you look at it as a literature piece, a lot of that, some of them are not really that great as literature. You know, they're more, you know, again, they're more part of our cultural history. You know, that's part of where we are. But yeah, but you know, that's part of the, you know, the poets that we don't read. We do read some of Sidney Lanier, and he wrote, you know, kind of a southern, you know, about good, you know, the South was good kind of thing. But so you have those aspects of in all of it. Now the New England, you're talking New England poetry, of course, their history is the abolitionists were New England.
Well, Paul, are you out of questions?
I am. I've enjoyed this time, though. Thank you.
Bob, we're going to have you back. We're going to be getting into the people I know you love, perhaps, well, I think you do, with Robert Frost, and that's going to be coming up a little later in our semester. We're going to make sure we've got your picture, as we did yesterday.
Yeah. I like them all. I like all. You know, I like poetry, and even the sometimes you know, the good part about it is the Confederate poets, and I mean, obviously I didn't like, you know, I mean, what they write about, but it is interesting. It is interesting how someone is going to present an idea that I find abhorrent. How do they present it so that I will read that and then see what it's about? And that's, you know, I think that's an important part too of just discovering, you know, because that's part of our American culture too. You know, I mean, we've got a very complex culture in our society, and you know, it becomes kind of a cliche to talk about the multi-ethnic and all this kind of stuff, but we do have that. We have poetry from all of those realms that we have access to, even more so now with the internet than ever before. So yeah, I'm glad to. I mean, you know, a lot of times I just kind of ramble, and I apologize for that.
We love you. We love your ramblings. I've known you many decades. So, but isn't that sort of the spirit? Because your rambling is a kind of poetry in a way. It's trying to grab onto the word as it goes down the stream. You know, you want to get with that word and let it take you somewhere. And in a way, that's what poetry does.
Yeah.
You know? And
well,
what
I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, I don't know. I just always I'd never, and I've told you before, I don't really view myself as much of a scholar at all. I know a lot, but I'm not really a scholar. I just love poetry, and I love all the ways it works, both from the language and culturally, how it fits in here and fits in there and becomes part of the piece, and it's interesting to see. So.
Are you a writer as well, Bob?
Not really. My wife wants me to start putting together some memoirs, but then I have to think about, you know, because really the stuff that probably be the best things to tell are the stuff you edit out first. I mean, I don't know if I want my daughter to read a lot of that. Oh, maybe she
There is that, isn't it? So all writers do censor themselves a bit, don't they? Most of them, anyway.
Yeah.
Well,
I have been reading more memoirs these days, though.
Yeah. Well, I'm always going to be grateful to you for many reasons, but you're the one that exposed me to Sam McGee. It's not in our period.
Service, Cremation of Sam McGee. I had all those great Yukon poetry, and later on, he's got he wrote incredible amounts of socialist poems. So you got, and you know, I always thought it's so funny because Robert Service was Ronald Reagan's favorite poet, absolute. And so here's this guy who, I mean, you know, who is kind of like a conservative icon in our culture, Ronald Reagan, and Robert Service has these wonderful Yukon poems, but then he had all these socialist poems he wrote about 20, 30 years later, and they're good too. They're good poems.
Well,
they don't have that same drive that the Cremation of Sam McGee has.
What's the last line of that? How does that end? Close the.
Let's see. Please close that. It's fine in here, and I greatly fear you'll let in the cold and storm since I left Tennessee down Plum Tree down in Tennessee. This is the first time I've been warm. When it's in the crematorium there. Yeah, I love that Sam McGee piece and Shooting of Dan McGrew and all that. I mean, those are great.
It's a joyful thing, our American poetic heritage.
Yeah.
And so we want to recommend that everybody get those books out that Great Aunt Mary gave you, and they're sitting on the shelf if they need to be dragged out. And we'll pick up with some more specific poets. We want to keep everybody on track. But, Bob, thank you for joining us from Asheville, North Carolina. You still have snow on the ground?
A little bit.
All right.
There's a little bit out here on my deck, a little bit in the front, a lot in the front yard, a lot in the backyard. But it's going fast.
Well, we hope you get some more so you can read some more poetry when you're snowbound, right? and we'll look forward to having you back, and everybody will look forward to seeing you as well as hearing you. And, Paul, we really appreciate you being part of this, and all of the people who are sending questions. And you can still send them in, and we can get them to Bob. So I guess we need to close up, though, because the world moves on.
That's right. Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you, Professor Carol, for letting me be a part of it. I just wanted to make sure that everybody remembers that this will be available to view online on professorcarol.com as well as on the YouTube channel. And just share it with your friends and invite them to come join us for the next Hangouts. We'll be here on Mondays at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern.
Nice chatting with you, Paul, too.
Yes. Pleasure, Bob. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.